I guess it's time for me to go back to work. I have enjoyed the summer and the excellent job that our fellows have done teaching our Sunday morning class for the last 3 months. And I'm already thinking about what we will do, God willing, next summer, and hopefully we'll be able to recruit even additional teachers. Now, I typically like to be closer to you when I'm teaching a Bible class, but I'm too lazy to move the laptop from here to there and then from there to here. So I'm just going to stay up here and try to be able to communicate to you effectively in a classroom setting where everyone is scattered. And I said something to somebody just a moment ago. I really don't care where you sit. I'm just happy you're here. And I hope that when we're done, you can honestly say that this is going to be something that will be of benefit to you. Let me, first of all, tell you that to my knowledge, we have no one in the congregation hospitalized at this time. I think that our announcement sheet may indicate that Kenny Bourne is in memorial. Kenny got out Friday evening, so if you're making announcements at the 10 o'clock hour, and I didn't check to see who's doing that, John, so if it's you, whoever, Kenny is now home. The only person at memorial that I want you to be aware of is Bill Butterfield. Some of you know Bill. He is the younger brother of Tom Butterfield. Tom and Bill are the sons of old Tom Butterfield, and the family is well known throughout the valley. Bill was diagnosed with colon cancer this past week, had surgery Thursday, and that surgery went very well, but Bill also has kidney disease and heart issues, and we want to keep him in our prayers. He's in Marietta Memorial Room 276. And Betty Rittenhouse, that's Sharon Anderson's sister, is home now. And there was somebody else that was hospitalized earlier this week that's also home, and that's on PowerPoint, I know. And I guess that's it. Kurt, do you have announcements today? Okay, I should pay more attention to those kinds of things. Somebody will update all of that for you, though, at the next hour. The purpose of this class is twofold. Number one, I want you to be familiar with the geography of the Old Testament as it relates to modern events, because much of what we're seeing in the news and have seen for some time now is directly tied to the Middle East. And of course, the Middle East is that section where Palestine is located, where Israel is, where the Palestinians reside, and where that conflict has been ongoing actually before I was born. There was a resolution in the UN in 1947 that restored Israel to Palestine with specific geographic borders and left a essentially two-tiered state, Palestine and Israel, and the Palestinians and the Israelis have been fighting ever since. And we want to understand that. We are familiar with the civil war in Syria, the problems with Iran. Everyone is familiar with Iraq and Saddam Hussein, Gulf Wars I and II. And all of this is directly tied to Old Testament history and to Old Testament geography. Just very quickly, Iraq is ancient Assyria. Iran is ancient Persia. And those two countries have been engaged in war for almost all of the history of human civilization. Additionally, the advent of Islam in the Middle East has had a very, I would say, negative impact on history since its founding in the 7th century AD. And we're all familiar with the problems with Islam, and in particular, those who hold to a very conservative view of that religion. And I would suggest to you that the conservatives are actually closer to what Islam is than the moderates are today. And the picture that's painted generally in the news is that Islam is a very peaceful religion, and you have to be essentially blind to facts to make that argument, because it is a religion of the sword. It began with military might, and it has been maintained throughout the centuries by the threat of death to those who will not convert. So that's the purpose. Ultimately, as we go through class, I want to be able to look at each of these areas and relate that geography to events in the Bible so that you can kind of tie it all together. But the first 2 or 3 sessions are designed simply to help us get a grip on why that part of the world is in such turmoil and how that ultimately impacts us. So we'll get started this morning at the very beginning, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, as I read Genesis 1, it is apparent to me that the first act of creation was the making out of nothing the heavens and the earth. And then days 1 through 6 describe what God did in succession to ultimately lead to the creation of man on day 6, which was the ultimate focal point of all that had been done. Many scholars believe that originally the earth was one land mass, and they use the term Pangea to describe that. I don't know if that is actually the case or not, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me, because with the flood, something really dramatic happened and everything changed. And so I certainly find nothing in Scripture that would in any way refute this idea, and in fact believe the flood would explain the division of continents and what we now know in modern geography. And I share this with you simply so that you will be aware of it in case you ever run across this term. Now, when we look at biblical history, we're looking essentially at the Middle East, from Egypt through Palestine and ultimately into Iraq and down into what's called Mesopotamia. That's the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the word literally means land between the waters. And the significance of this area for biblical students lies in the fact, first, that when we are introduced to Abraham, Abraham is a resident in Ur of the Chaldees. Now, Ur of the Chaldees is generally thought to have been located near the Persian Gulf, and you can see it on the map behind me, I hope. I did not know until today that the slides were no longer filling the screen. That was news to me. I just happened to see this one and realized it doesn't look like it looks on my computer. And John tells me that with the new projector, there's some issue with this computer. And if John can't fix it, I know I can't. So we're going to simply adjust to this new transition to a different view. It looks really good on the computer, by the way. Ur of the Chaldees is where Abraham was when he received orders from God to move. And he moved northwest approximately 600 miles to Haran, or Haran. And he resided there until the death of his father Terah. Now, let me pause and tell you that there are a few folks that think that Ur was actually located much closer to Haran than where we have it located here on the Persian Gulf. But I think this is probably the more accurate map. He did make a rather lengthy journey. And once his father Terah died, he then began his pilgrimage south, ultimately going all the way into Egypt. And then from Egypt, he came back into Canaan, modern Palestine, where he lived the remainder of his life as a nomad. And when you look at biblical history, this is the area that comes to the forefront. Included in modern history today are Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, and because of the great oil deposits in this region of the world, Saudi Arabia comes into play, though it's not a major player in the Old Testament or the New Testament. It's certainly a major factor today in what's going on in that region of the world. But I want you to remember Abraham's journey and how essentially his entire life encompasses this area that we're going to be focusing on this week. This is a modern map of the Middle East today, and I want you to look at it carefully because this is where we're going to spend our time for the next quarter. And in particular, notice Turkey, which is in purple on my map, and yeah, it's in purple on yours as well. Turkey right now is in turmoil. You may recall just a few weeks ago there was an attempted coup. Turkey is an Islamic state, but up until recently they had been a secular Islamic state, contrasted with a place like Iran, which is a very non-secular state. In fact, in Iran, the Ayatollahs really carry the day. They control events that occur in that region of the world to this very hour. And Turkey seems to be in a transition from secular Islam to this devout form of Islam that characterizes Iran. Now, Saudi Arabia is also Islamic. In fact, the centers of Islam are in Saudi Arabia, Medina and Mecca. The prophet of Islam, Muhammad, was a native of Saudi Arabia, and they are the arch enemies of Iran. And it has something to do with the two major sects in Islam, the Sunnis and the Shias. And we'll get to that at some point in our study as well. But that whole area is just a mess. It has been a mess for essentially 1,400 years with the advent of Islam. And there is absolutely, folks, and I'm being honest with you, nothing to indicate that it's going to get better. I would say in time, but I'm not sure that even time is going to heal the wounds in this part of the world, because they are constantly sowing the seeds of hatred. And most of you know that Iran wants to destroy Israel, and one of their goals is to have nuclear weapons that will enable them to accomplish that goal, because the Ayatollahs in Iran are so anti-Semitic. They just simply do not want Israel to exist as a state. So that's the modern map of the world that we're going to be looking at. Now, to figure out how things got in the state they're in, we need to understand a little bit of history. Now, I know a lot of people don't like history, but if you want to really understand the way things are today, you have to understand essentially two important points. Number one, the role of the British Empire in the Middle East, and number two, the rise of Islam. So today, and God willing next Sunday, that will be our focus, and perhaps for a few weeks after, depending on how quickly I move through this study. You all heard, I'm sure, the sun never sets on the British Empire. This was a phrase that was used to describe the empire when it had reached its zenith. It was the largest empire in the world, covering more than 13 million square miles and influencing 458 million people. That was in 1938. Now, regarding the empire, Britain understood the value of oil early on. And though much of this region is merely desert, it is desert that holds billions of barrels of oil. And Britain wanted that oil, so it needed the influence over the region. In 1875, Britain bought the shares of the Suez Canal owned by Egypt, which made them the largest stockholder and essentially gave them control of the canal and ensured safe passage. Now, the Suez Canal connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, and it's an extremely abbreviated trip then from Britain to India, another one of those areas of British influence in the empire. And it was absolutely essential that the Suez Canal maintain operation at all times, and this kind of assured that. A picture of the Suez Canal, by the way. Bowen, have you been there? I kind of thought so. Bowen was on an aircraft carrier. That shows you how they were scraping the bottom of the barrel to... I digress. We'll move on. If you were in the Navy serving our country, you probably are familiar with this geography in a way you'd rather not be. 1876 to 1882, there was an Anglo-Egyptian war. Now, the only one that would probably know anything about this is Mary, and even she wasn't around then. The British and the Egyptians met, and as a result of the war, Britain seized control of the canal, took full ownership. And then in 1915, in the middle of the First World War, there was an agreement to divide up the Ottoman Empire. How many of you have heard of the Ottoman Empire, by the way? This is what is today modern Turkey. And the Islamic State, under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, really controlled vast territory and vast resources. But the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, made the mistake of siding with Germany and Austria against the Allied forces in World War I. And even before victory was declared, agreements were made between the British and the Russians and the British and the French to divide up the Ottoman Empire at the end of the war. And they would do that without any consideration to anything other than lines in the sand. And I'll say more about that at some other point in our study. They didn't consider religious makeup or ethnic makeup or anything like that. And as a result, you have a place like Iraq today that consists of Shia, Sunni, and Kurds. And these three folks don't get along, and they haven't. And so it has been a nation in turmoil for a long, long time. And peace was maintained only when Saddam Hussein came on the scene as a very corrupt and vicious dictator who just eliminated enemies by killing them. And he served as a buffer, by the way, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are arch enemies, though both are Muslim nations, as well as between Iran and Israel. But it all goes back to what happened at the close of World War I with the division of the land. In 1914 through 18, World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire occurred. In 1916, the British encouraged the Arab Revolt. I'll say a little bit more about each of these in just a moment. If you're familiar with Lawrence of Arabia, he was the central figure in the Arab Revolt. You probably have seen the movie, which is loosely based on the life of a real British character. In 1916, the Middle East was essentially carved up by the British with the aid of France and Russia. In 1914 to 18, the seeds for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict actually began to be sown. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine, to divide it between Jews and Palestinians. It was not quite 50-50, but that was the solution to the conflict. Palestine was until then ruled by Britain as a kind of protectorate. Britain was in charge of what went on, and it was never an easy job, and they decided that they just turn everything over to the UN and let them figure it out because they were absolutely at a loss to know what to do. Well, when the UN voted to partition, the British, at the date of the establishment of Israel and Palestine, pulled out, and the next day 5 Arab nations invaded the Israeli territory. But the Israelis defeated them and claimed additional territory to the extent that at this point they occupy the vast majority of the Palestinian land. And that's why the Palestinians have so little use for the Israelis. And the Israelis, of course, claim this is our land from biblical history and you don't have any title to it at all. And so this just constant back and forth is actually fed by families on both sides raising their children to hate the other side and to keep this conflict ongoing. Now, sometimes we talk about the Old Testament story of Abraham and his sons Isaac and Ishmael. You'll know that Isaac is the one through which the Jews trace their lineage, and Ishmael is the one through whom the Arabs trace their lineage to Abraham. And there was real conflict there, and some of that, in fact, has carried over all the way into the present. And then you look at the situation with Jacob and Esau, and you see a similar kind of thing, though the story of Jacob and Esau is really interesting. Those two patched up their differences, but their offspring never did. So they are familiar in this part of the world with the kinds of animosities that keep conflicts going. And then in the end of World War II, Iraq becomes essentially the end of World War I, and then in the end of World War II, Iraq continues to be under British control. It started in World War I. It continued in World War II until about 1952 when they were given some autonomy, and that ultimately led to Saddam and modern problems. So very quickly now, here's what we're dealing with. 1914 to 1918, the Germans attempted to take over Europe. This was their goal. It was thwarted. The Allies won, and the Middle East was affected by this victory. The Ottoman Empire was, as I've already said, carved up. And it was the result of secret agreements made while the war was still underway. At the end of this war, then, Great Britain occupied what is today Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, and the Transjordan area, and maintained that control for quite a long time. The Arab Revolt, Sir Lawrence of Arabia, 1916, was an effort to in some way undermine the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs revolted under the rule of the Ottomans and were quite successful, but when this happened, the British just kind of backed away and didn't provide the support that was necessary for the purposes of the revolt to continue. And I'm not wanting to be in any way political in this class, but it's kind of similar to what happened in Iraq when Saddam was killed and democracy was established and things were starting to really come together, and then all of a sudden the American forces and her allies just withdrew. And they left a void, and when you have a void like that and you have a nation of Kurds, Sunnis, and Shias, and they don't get along, they start fighting. And there's no one there to referee or maintain the peace, and therefore there's no real law and order. And you couple that with the civil war in Syria, and the rise of ISIS, and you get a feel for really what happened. Now, I'm not going to debate whether we should have invaded or should not have invaded, whether there were weapons of mass destruction or there weren't. None of that matters at this point. The fact is that Iraq was on a reasonably good footing until forces withdrew that could maintain that stability. And they're right back to their old ways. And with Syria being in turmoil, this just led to even greater problems. So I want you to be able to see all of that and understand it from both the biblical and the Islamic perspective. The Middle East was essentially carved up in 1916 through these secret agreements. And the little map that you see, you'll see a larger one when we deal with the advent of Islam. Lines in the sand, so to speak, without any regard to ethnicity or religion. The British and the French just decided we will divvy up this way and we'll just draw lines like surveyors, just make it as easy as we can for us without any regard for the people that inhabit these regions. And you see a place like Iraq, which is the outline in red, and you see the problem with the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds all being in there together. And right now the Kurds are seeking their own homeland, and the Shia and the Sunni are at each other's throats, and it's just a constant state of turmoil with car bombings and suicide attacks and all kinds of things. And it goes all the way back to the way the boundaries were determined. Had they given thought to ethnicity and religion and drawn different boundaries, it would have probably been a much different story. 1914 to 1918, how many of you are familiar with the name Balfour? Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary. It's during this time that Jews in Britain began to demand their own homeland. They want to be restored to Palestine, and the Foreign Secretary is all on board for that. And he is one who will take the lead in ultimately bringing about the establishment of Israel in Palestine with a Palestinian state as well. He ruled, Britain ruled Palestine from 1920 to 1947. 1947, Britain said to the UN, which is, as you know, a relatively new body, designed to ensure peace in our time, so to speak. This body would come together and they would solve all the world's problems and end war and all of that. Yeah, I saw Kurt smile. It didn't happen. But the British were, they just wanted out. So they said to the UN, you take care of this. You do what's necessary. So the UN recommended the two-state situation that currently exists in Palestine. According to the plan, 56.47% of Palestine was given to the Jewish state, and 43.53% of Palestine would go to the Arabs. Now, obviously, that doesn't seem fair, does it? If you were going to do something fairly, 50-50. Any little kid can tell you when you break a candy bar, you break it down the middle or it isn't fair unless they get the bigger piece. And it's only fair for one. Well, this was not fair, and the Palestinians knew that, but they really have no other recourse. Look at the maps. Prior to 1947, the Green Territory, this is Palestine, modern Israel. The Green Territory prior to 1947 was Palestinian. Then in 1947, it's divided, 53, 40, whatever. And you see the green remains Palestine, but all that is in white becomes Jewish territory. Well, a day after the British pull out, as I said, 5 armies, Arab armies, invaded, but were defeated, and Israel claimed even more territory. So what you see in the third map is 47 to 67. And then we go to 2000, and look at how little Palestinian land remains. Now, I really don't have a dog in this hunt. I am not anti-Semitic. I'm not pro-Israel. I'm not anti-Palestine, pro-Palestine. But I look at this, and I can understand why the Palestinians would be so upset, can't you? Can you imagine owning a farm and some governmental body suddenly says, we're going to give 53% of your farm to somebody else and you can keep 47 or whatever. And before you know it, they've got 98% and you've got 2%. And how do you feel about that? That's where the Palestinians are. And militarily, they are no match for Israel's army. Israel has one of the best equipped, best trained armies in the world. Everybody serves in the army who can for a specific period of time, and they don't lose wars typically. So they have been able to increase over and over again their territory at the expense of the Palestinians. And most folks are completely unaware of how this occurred and why we have this conflict in this region of the world. But when you see how it played out, can't you understand why they don't get along? The Jews are saying, hey, we were given this land by God in perpetuity. Now, the fact is that's not the case. If you look at what God promised Israel, He promised them the land if they would be faithful, and told them if they weren't, they would lose it. They lost it, and they have no biblical claim to it today. Now, there are vast numbers of people here in America who are ardent supporters of Israel because they believe that Israel's existence in this part of the world is essential to the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the return of Christ, and the establishment of His millennial kingdom. So there is a segment of modern society in America that supports Israel without question because they believe that Israel is intricate to God's fulfilling His promise, not only to give them the land in perpetuity, but for them to be alive and well as a nation when Christ returns. In the very early 80s, Hal Lindsey's book came out, 1980s Countdown to Armageddon, and one of the things he argued was that the Lord was about to return. Israel was reestablished as a nation in 1947, and he said that was one of the key requirements, and the other was the reestablishment of the Roman Empire, because no one can get around Daniel 2:44. In the days of these kings, Romans, God would set up a kingdom which would break apart and consume all of the kingdoms of the world and would know no end. Of course, he was talking about the church, the kingdom of Christ, but the prophecy is taken literally, and Lindsey argued that the reconstitution of the Roman Empire occurred with the establishment of the European Union. And he said when the European Union had 10 members, then, and not until then, would Christ return. So much of Christendom, the denominational world in America, supports Israel because of the false belief in the millennial reign of Christ and the need for Israel and the Roman Empire both to be in existence when Christ returns. Now, there is no millennial reign. There's nothing in Scripture that calls for either the existence of Israel or the Roman Empire for Christ to come. The thing that Jesus said repeatedly was that His coming would be like the thief in the night. There's no warning. There's no sign or signs that we can point to. And honestly, there's no criteria for His return other than God's patience finally coming to an end. And He's extremely patient, 2 Peter 3, 8, and 9. But there's a limit to that patience. And when the time is up, it's up. And it has nothing to do with Israel. But I wanted you especially to see what's happened from 1946 to the present to help you understand why this part of the world, Israel, which, by the way, this territory is about 1/3 the size of the state of Ohio. That's how much land we're talking about in Palestine today. And Israel occupies nearly all of it. And the Palestinians, of course, continue to do what they can to disrupt life in Israel. And I can't defend violence on either side, but I understand how Palestinians must feel having simply been told, what was yours is no longer yours. It now belongs to the Jewish state, and you have to deal with it. Well, they haven't dealt with it very well, but would you expect them to? And there's no real resolution to this anytime soon either. The only possibility of resolving this conflict is for people to come to know Jesus Christ and the gospel and embrace the forgiveness that Scripture advocates on the part of believers. And let's be realistic. We don't see that happening. I would like to tell you that I'm optimistic and, at some point we're going to win the world for Jesus. We are always going to be in the minority. Christians have always been and will always be in the minority. That's why Jesus describes the straight and narrow and the wide and broad, and few walk the straight and narrow. Most travel the wide, the broad way that leads to destruction. The gospel of Jesus Christ does not appeal to the masses. It never has. It never will. And you may say, well, look at Jerusalem in Acts 2. There were about 3,000 baptisms. This is a city of over 1 million. Do the math. 3,000 is not many. And yes, they continued to grow by leaps and bounds, but they went everywhere preaching the word. And even in its heyday, Christians remained in the minority. We are in the minority now. We always will be, because the God of this world has the hearts and minds of the masses. But there are people out here in this world who are searching, who are longing for truth, and who will embrace it and obey it. And our goal is to reach as many of them as we can while we still can. But don't be optimistic about seeing the conversion of the world. It's not going to happen, and the Bible acknowledges that over and over again. And by the way, if you go back to Isaiah 6 and read Isaiah's call to the prophetic office, he wants to know essentially, what am I going to do and how long am I going to do it? And he's told you're going to take God's word with you wherever you go. And by the way, you're going to do it as long as you live, and let me clue you in, you're not going to have much success numerically. But God measures success by faithfulness, not by numbers. And it's just the opposite of what the world does. But this is the advent of the Palestinian conflict, and I think when you see how it unfolded, you can understand why there's a conflict to begin with. So 1948, with the expiration of the British Mandate, May the 14th, in fact, 1948, the state of Israel was proclaimed, the first Jewish state in over 2,000 years. The British left, and the very next day, May 15th, the armies of Jordan and Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq invaded Israel. Now, you would think that this would be a no-brainer. This is a brand new nation, not large numerically, not large geographically. It should be easily conquered. But it wasn't. And they've made additional attempts, as you know, all with similar failure. So this led to Israel claiming even more land, which obviously did not go over well with the Palestinians nor their backers in the Arab world. After World War I, the self-serving interest of, I don't know where that one came from.
Little attention was paid to the country's ethnic communities. We've already talked about that. In 1921, this is Iraq now. The British were granted control until then. In 1932, they granted independence to Iraq, and there was a royal family which governed for a time. But in 1958, there was a revolt. The revolt led to the establishment of the Republic of Iraq, and then there's a series of military and civilian governments until ultimately we get to Saddam Hussein. And when we get to him, I'll just say you know the rest of the story. So that's the British role in all of this. Now, it really is tied into how maps were drawn and how people of different religious and ethnic backgrounds were forced to live together, and they didn't live in harmony. It's also based on how Israel as a state came into being. It was the Jews, the Zionists in Great Britain who got the ear of the government, who then enlisted on the side of the Jews, pushed for the establishment of a Jewish state, which took half of the Palestinian land, in fact more than half, and led to the continual conflicts that we see even to the present. Now, I heard that bell, and what we're going to do next Sunday morning is look at the advent of Islam in relationship to the Middle East and the divisions there between the Sunnis and the Shia and what that's all about and why there is the constant fighting between these two groups. Right now, Saudi Arabia is frightened to death of Iran. And it's because one is Sunni and the other is Shia, and they hate each other. And Iran wants to rule essentially the world of Islam, but Saudi Arabia stands in the way because the holy sites of Islam are in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is ruled by a monarchy, the family of Saud. They're able to keep their position because they made an alliance with clerics in Saudi Arabia who follow a man by the name of Wahhab. You've heard of Wahhabism? He looked at what was going on in the Islamic world and said, these folks are just not conservative enough. We need a more conservative brand of Islam. And he began to teach and advocate. And in order for King Faisal and others to remain in power, the Saud family, the monarchy, made a deal with this man. We will supply you money to teach your version of Islam if you will support us as rulers of this region. And so the Saudi Arabian government has continued to funnel not millions, but billions and billions of dollars to this Wahhabi movement, Wahhabism, which is the most fundamental and strict of all of the Islamic groups. So they've essentially made a deal with the devil to keep them in power, but the one that they have made this deal with is doing everything he can to undermine, and his followers now to undermine Saudi government and ultimately to sow the seeds of discourse throughout the entire Arab world and ultimately to impact the West. ISIS is an offshoot, frankly, of this particular section of Islam called Wahhabism. And we'll talk about that next week, the development of Islam. And then we'll begin to put the biblical events in perspective with modern history and the map so that we can see what's going on. But again, I know a lot of you, because you've told me you don't like history, but that's what the Old Testament is. And to understand modern history, you have to understand the past. And when you see from World War I to the present what happened with the British Empire, and then you look at Islam and its development and what that has meant for this region, I think it really comes into focus, and you'll have a much better understanding of why things are so messed up over there, and why what has been a problem for that region, it seems like forever, is suddenly impacting the West in the way it is. They're not content to keep their troubles at home. They really believe that we're all infidels, and there's only two possibilities for infidels. You convert or you die, and they don't care which. And they're intent on establishing a new empire, or caliph. There are two different pronunciations, a caliphate or caliphate. I understand caliphate is the correct, but I keep hearing caliphate, so we'll use both back and forth next week. Thank you for being